Não é tempo técnico, mas é intervalo aqui no podcast. Já imaginou se seu time tivesse um seguro para não perder nunca? Pois é, isso não existe. Mas com a Zurich Seguros, quem não perde nunca é você. Na Zurich Seguros, os planos se adequam às suas necessidades em qualquer momento da sua vida. Seja seguro de auto, residência, vida e muito mais. Diferente de alguns times, na Zurich Seguros você pode confiar. Para saber mais, acesse zurich.com.br ou consulte seu corretor.
Sair da escola já com uma formação profissional no currículo? Parece bom demais pra ser verdade, né? Pois é. No ensino técnico do Senac, isso é possível. É ensino médio junto com formação técnica, que acontece durante os 3 anos. Lá, eles usam metodologia para projetos, desenvolvendo competências como resolução de problemas, pensamento crítico e colaboração, além de valores éticos e sustentáveis. Quer saber? Senac. Acesse sp.senac.br/ensino médio e saiba mais.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and inevitably Max Verstappen has been crowned world champion for a 4th time, while less inevitably, Mercedes bagged a 1-2 headed by George Russell in Las Vegas. So what happened to pre-weekend favourite Ferrari, and why did the Silver Arrows hit their target for the first time since before the August break? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to make sense of it all are Ben Anderson, Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, we'll get straight into it because we knew it was coming. What better place to seal it than Las Vegas? Max Verstappen is now a 4 times world champion. So where does this championship win of his stand for you?
Well, I don't think it's the hardest, because I think the first one, will always be up there as one of the all-time toughest titles for either of those drivers to win back in 2021. But I think it's the best of the 4, because 2021 you had a little bit of the the driving tactics and what happened in the run in the last 2 or 3 events. Obviously, the way that it was settled with the fact that he was not going to be world champion until a few laps before the end and the intervention. 2022 and 2023, he was fantastic, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves for how good a job he did in those 2 seasons, because he had the best car, and everybody just always ends up assuming that makes it easy. But to have overcome the hurdles that he has this year, the fact that he's spent, I would say, 60 or 70% of the season without the fastest car, he has done absolutely everything he needed to. He dominated when he had the best car, and he was relentlessly good, and somehow still winning for a lot longer than he should have been when he didn't have the best car anymore. So I definitely think it's his best title.
Yeah, lots of different ways of winning titles, isn't it, Mark? And we've said it plenty of times. We don't need to say he's a great, because he's been a great for some time already. But to win this title with a couple of races to spare, with the way things have been going for much of the season, is astounding, isn't it?
It is, and it's been an unusually shaped season for him as well. I mean, dominant earlier on, and then really struggling. Sort of that dip, that sort of mid to latter season dip, and then sort of coming back into semi-contention since Austin. So although, we've seen 4 teams win multiple races, which is, I think, unprecedented, and 4 teams getting 1-2s in different races, it's still been a case that he's had to defend an early lead. And he's been absolutely faultless in how he's done that, and in terms of efficiency, and in terms of the peak of his best drives, and certainly Brazil a couple of weeks ago was I would say the best drive anyone put in this season by quite some margin. So absolutely worthy of a champion, but it's given that we had so many competitive cars, it's almost a little disappointing that the points battle sort of emerged with the pattern that it did, with them defending. If we'd had those 4 teams in contention throughout, equally competitive cars throughout, I'm sure he would have still won it, but it would have been a more thrilling season, I'm sure, and one which would have lasted a bit longer, perhaps. But I mean, you can't sort of choose how you win them, and he's he's just done an absolutely fantastic job, obviously, as has the team. And you get under the way they've remained focused, and this, even when there were all sorts of stuff happening internally at the beginning of the season, and then all the technical sort of how they dropped the ball later in the season, they've still remained incredibly cool, calm operationally, and it's the whole thing has just been super impressive. Yep.
And we saved the best tribute to last because Ben is, of course, the person who had the first clash with Max Verstappen in Max Verstappen's single-seater career. So maybe you've got a different perspective.
Yeah, he looked super quick back then, but yeah, a bit, he's a bit careless in battle. But look how much he's progressed in the 10 years since. Taught him everything he knows, as he said to me when I first interviewed him in F1 circles at Suzuka that year. You run out of superlatives, really, but you can sense also there's a reverence for him in the paddock. Inevitably, other drivers and personnel were asked about Max and him making it number 4 post-race. And Fernando Alonso, who obviously knows what it's like to fight for a championship in a car that's not really quite capable of winning that championship and not quite getting them over the line, I sense that he's particularly impressed with Max this year for doing just that. The Red Bull's dropped not even really to the second best car. It's probably been third, sometimes fourth best in the latter part of the season. And he's found a way to get it over the line. Obviously, he benefited from that head start, but there's also just that way he's maximised the result almost every time, regardless of how uncompetitive the car has been. That's really impressed McLaren. Andrea Stella was talking up that element of how difficult it is to win, even when you've got a good car, as Scott alluded to. Max hasn't had that and still has been able to grind out tough results and really set the benchmark for Lando Norris to learn from. And Lando Norris himself called Max the best driver in the world. So we're living in the era of Max Verstappen, as Stella put it, and he's raising the bar each time, and it's up to everyone else to do a better job and try and bring him down. Yeah,
an astonishing driver, relentless, ruthless, able to dominate from the front, able to get the best possible results in a mediocre car, just absolutely superb this season. Can't speak highly enough of him. We could talk about him for this whole podcast, but we're not going to do that now because you do have a race to get into. But we're going to come back to Max Verstappen, I'm sure, at the end of the season and see if we can find a few other ways to apply superlatives to him. So let's get into the race now, Mark. We'll have a twist on the traditional how the race was won question for you now. Where did that Mercedes performance come from?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's got multiple levels.
Good answer, please.
Yeah, okay. It's got multiple levels of answer, actually. There's a pattern in that it's very competitive when the track is cool. We saw Montreal, Silverstone, Spa. The way it generates tyre temperature much more quickly than the others is a real boon in those sort of conditions. And that was absolutely crucial in George's pole position here. As Sainz pointed out, even after the Ferrari had done a prep lap and George did the lap immediately, he was losing 0.3 to George through sector 1 simply because the tyres weren't quite ready on the Ferrari. And nobody could make the tyres quite ready at the first sector other than a Mercedes, which could do it even without the luxury of a prep lap. George gained 0.3 on the Ferrari through that first sector and was on pole by 1/10. So just tells you that intrinsically it wasn't necessarily the fastest car over a lap. It's just if you factor tyre performance into the performance of the car, it was. So that was why it was quick in qualifying, but the expectation was, and it was backed up by the long run data, that the Ferrari would be quicker in the race, and it absolutely wasn't. Of course, it was the Mercedes, and I think, and not by a small amount either. There were times when Russell was just after stint 1, when he'd emerged from the stops sort of with a 10-second cushion. He was obviously just managing from there, but he could have gone a whole lot faster. And talking to the strategists, they said we could easily have done a one-stop. Actually, we only did a two just to match everybody else in case it was a safety car. There was no concern about tyre durability either. So then you think, well, why was that? And you'll have heard a lot about how Red Bull didn't come here with a suitable wing because they didn't bother doing a Monza wing. I haven't bothered doing a Monza wing for the last 3 years for reasons of the cost cap. It's a very expensive development, an entirely new wing, and that's an easy way of making an economy. And so you need it for 2, maybe 3 races to have the ultimate wing at those low downforce tracks, Monza in particular, here, Baku to an extent. So there was that. So Mercedes have done a proper Monza wing, which was much more efficient than just cutting bits off like a Spa wing, which is what Red Bull ended up doing. Their Monza wing was much better than the Ferrari's Monza wing. The Ferrari's Monza wing was ultimate low downforce, but not ultimate efficiency. The Mercs was much more efficient. It generated quite a lot more downforce than the Ferrari's wing, and you could see why looking at the profiles of the 2 wings. So essentially, I think the Mercs' race performance came from having more downforce. And even though we're talking about Red Bull not being able to shed enough drag, the Merc, because it had a properly configured Monza wing, could generate decent downforce with low drag. The Ferrari was even lower drag. It was perhaps a little bit too low for here. And so you could see from in-car Leclerc and in-car Sainz at various points as they were following Russell, just how much the Merc would pull out in the traction zones. It was just so much faster out the corners. And that's also looking after the rear tyres. And although graining fronts was the limitation here, it was also marginal. The rears, you could easily have grained the rears if you weren't too careful. So that was also a limitation. So I think generally that tyre advantage was facilitated by the downforce choices that the teams were making. And then on top of all that, as the third element of the answer, George Russell finally gave, as the season's quite late now and there's not so much secrecy around, he gave a proper full explanation of why the car is good on a track like this. And he's saying basically, as long as it's smooth, we can run it as low as we want, we're fast. It's only if you get tracks that need a lot of curb or that have got bumps in it, we have to raise it to a ride height where it just does not work. So we can run it if we can run it nice and low and stiff. He said we're fast. He said, but we've probably gone a little bit too far on that, and there's not many tracks where that applies. So there's three reasons. There's instant tyre performance in qualifying, which got Russell the track position. There's the wing choice, which protected the tyres in the race, and there's the fact that the track was perfectly configured for to put the Merc in the right height window.
Well, you promised a good answer and you delivered in several levels, which I always like to hear. Scott, just to bring you in, we had a question from Thomas Knights from the Race Members Club. He said, did Lewis Hamilton's mistakes in Q3 ultimately cost him the win, or at least deprive us of a great battle for the victory? Because that was the other factor, wasn't it? Hamilton came through to second place from 10th on the grid.
Certainly the latter. Certainly cost us a battle with Russell. That would have been fascinating to see them running at the front together. I think there's a very good chance Lewis would have won this race if he'd qualified even on the front row alongside Russell, had he not quite been able to beat him. Sadly, there was a little bit of an air of inevitability around Hamilton hitting a problem in Q3. Just look, both mistakes, they were different mistakes, but both of them just seemed to have the air a little bit of just overreaching slightly. I know that there is often the narrative about how the car changes or suddenly gets worse in qualifying, but you saw he had it in Q1 and Q2. The pace was there. He knew the pace was there, and I think the way he talked after qualifying indicated that Lewis knew it was just straight up mistake on his part. But the quality of the car and the feeling that he had in it meant that there was a sort of a confidence, a poise about his driving that we haven't seen for quite a few races now. And there was a point where he was following Verstappen, I think it was, and really getting close to the Red Bull before overtaking him, where you could just see how much more grip Hamilton had and how much more purposeful the car looked through the corners. And I think I said quite early in the race, once he'd sort of made his way pretty quickly through the sort of lead midfielders, that there was a double podium on the cards for Mercedes, because Hamilton looked, if that pace could continue, it looked inevitable. So he'll be kicking himself, because there was definitely a chance to win this Grand Prix. But if in the context of the last few races, completing a 1-2 isn't exactly a bad day's work from 10th on the grid. And he will be quite pleased to have shown that he wasn't just the kind of distant completion of the 1-2. He really, really hacked into that Russell lead and showed how fast he was.
Yeah, and especially given there was all that talk after Brazil, which, to be honest, Lewis Hamilton himself kind of triggered by saying, he almost can't wait to the end of the season. Had a horrible weekend at Interlagos. So it's, I think he was probably quite pleased just to show everyone that, he has still got it, and the car was there, and he was there. It was just that Q3, that shortcomings that led him down. We should talk about Ferrari a bit now, of course, Ben, because they fell back early on with the graining that was Charles Leclerc about that after the race, said it was going to be graining defined. How surprised were you? And he was like, I was really worried, because sort of after 4 laps, just the pace dropped off. So that was part of their problem on their way to 3rd and 4th with Sainz and Leclerc. But there was also a bit of a mini controversy, wasn't there? Leclerc had some choice words over the radio at the end of the race. So what was he so angry about? And did he have a point?
Yeah, he was very cross with himself. He declared himself too effing nice in a rant over the radio at the end, triggered by Sainz overtaking him after the second pit stops. It seemed as though there'd been instructions issued over the radio for Sainz to not attack Leclerc, because they knew, having pitted Sainz later than he wanted to be pitted to get onto his last set of hards, and pitting Leclerc when they did, they were going to meet on track. And Sainz attacked Leclerc, overtook him, and that annoyed Leclerc, because he felt like, as has often been the case, he's played the team game at Ferrari. Obviously, he's well embedded there, loves the team, helped Sainz win in Singapore last season by sacrificing himself in the first stint. And I think he feels like he plays nice, and sometimes Sainz doesn't reciprocate when he should. And there's probably an element of Sainz being belligerent, because, he's going to have to give up his seat in a couple of races to Lewis Hamilton, just as Ferrari's coming really good, just as they might take a Constructors' Championship, just as he might have a shot at Drivers' Championship next year for the first time. And you've sensed over the last few races, actually, this dawning on Sainz, that, the team he's going to, Williams, is still a bit shambolic, still a bit of a mess. The team he's leaving is really peaking. And he's a bit sad, I think, that he feels he's put a lot of work into getting Ferrari where they are. We know how good he is technically and as a driver, and he's not going to reap the rewards of that. So I think Sainz is a little bit racing for himself in these final races, really dancing on that line of, doing what's best for the team. And that's irritated Leclerc. And then Leclerc's just thinking to himself, as he does when he self-flagellates at the end of a race, this is partly down to me and my mentality. I'm playing too nice, and maybe he does need to toughen up a bit.
It's one of those strange things, though, isn't it? I understand why Sainz is a bit annoyed, but I feel like if you're going to go against team orders a little bit, you should do it when it's a win, rather than whether you finish 3rd or not. But
Will it dictate the conversation that Vasseur says they're going to have about it? Because is it really worth making this point? When you're so close to the end with Sainz, when he's leaving anyway, does it risk just making him more belligerent if you start to make a big deal of it? They might just say to Charles, look, you're right. As his engineer was trying to say on the radio, you did the right thing. Maybe it's just one of those to park, and next year's a reset anyway. You've got a new guy coming in. Don't worry about it too much.
But also, it wasn't like Sainz had done something totally egregious with the manner in which he overtook Leclerc and the way that they tried to handle things. Because if Sainz was... I take Ben's point, and I do agree that there's clearly an element of Sainz racing for himself and taking charge in the way that we know Carlos does so effectively during Grand Prix. But if he was really, really determined not to play the team game, he wouldn't have let Leclerc through the way that he did during the second stint, because that was only a driver who is very, very good at playing the team game while looking after themselves could have somehow managed to let Leclerc through in that moment without losing another place himself to Hamilton. It was so well judged from Sainz. So you then get to the point where he is right behind Leclerc after Leclerc comes out of the pits and they're racing to the end, where they're one apiece in the race for letting the other through. Leclerc had done it in the first stint. Sainz had done it in the second stint. Sainz has effectively got to a position where he's not fully undercut Leclerc, but got right onto him again. And there's a massive offset in terms of tyre performance, because we know how cold it was, difficult to fire up the tyres the way you need to. If Sainz had kind of spent that outlap really chasing to get onto the back of Leclerc and then, forcing him to defend for a few corners and then drives past after a lap and a half, I'd kind of understand it. But Sainz encountering Leclerc completely naturally and then just basically driving past him because there's a massive speed difference between them. It was a very easy move. It wasn't like Sainz massively sent it. I don't have a massive problem with that, because that just felt a little bit like, is there really any point here in losing a load of race time? We're still chasing a podium in this Grand Prix. What benefit is there to maybe lose a second and a half, 2 seconds if Leclerc's outlap's very slow or the tyre warm-up takes a while, whatever it is. So I think given...
Depends on what they've been told, though, doesn't it? Like Leclerc passed Sainz at the first corner, so maybe there was a first corner agreement that we don't know about. Leclerc was obviously annoyed too that he's fighting for second in the championship as he sees it. So if he was expecting Sainz not to attack him because of whatever instructions were issued or plans were agreed, and then he does and keeps the place... that's going to be enough to trigger Leclerc, isn't it? Regardless of whether the circumstances were not Sainz's fault.
No, I don't. To be clear, I'm not saying Leclerc's wrong to be annoyed by this. He's right to be annoyed by it, and I'd be annoyed by it if it happened to him. But I don't think it was, an overt offensive case of someone ignoring team orders.
No, agreed.
That's how it feels to me, because if you look at the communication, even between, not even looking at what Sainz was told, what Leclerc was told. The initial message was that he won't overtake you, and then the next message was he's been told not to put pressure on you. Those are different things. If Sainz comes up to the back, if Sainz has been told don't put pressure on Leclerc, comes up to the back of him and it drives past effectively with DRS and massively almost, that's not putting pressure on him. That's actually the least race time lost for both of them, probably. So I can see what I think there was enough of a grey area that Sainz can argue the toss and say, well, this has all been a little bit chaotic. Let's not trip up over each other. Let's just crack on. I don't think it was like a total slam dunk.
The upshot is that Ferrari did finish third and fourth, took 12 points out of McLaren in the Constructors' Championship. So it was 36 points. They've taken 12 points out of it. The gap's now 24. It's the first part of the end triple header, so they've taken exactly a third of the lead out of it. So you could say they're bang on track, but the maths doesn't quite slice and dice like that. But Ferrari, not quite the spectacular weekend, the possible 1-2 we thought they could have, because obviously of the way the tyres were behaving in particular and all the factors that Mark explained. But the Constructors' Championship still very much alive.
Christine, have you ever bought something and thought, wow, this product actually made my life better?
Totally. And usually I find those products through Wirecutter.
Yeah, but you work here.
Yeah, that's true. I do. We both do. We're the hosts of The Wirecutter Show from the New York Times.
It's our job to research, test, and vet products, and then recommend our favorites.
For instance, Kyra, I think you've slept on 40 mattresses?
Yep. And Christine, you've tested everything from blenders to linen sheets.
Oh, I love linen sheets.
And we're bringing all of this expertise to The Wirecutter Show. Each week, we'll talk to someone from our team of 140 journalists about the very best product picks in every category.
Plus tips, tricks, and hacks that go beyond the products. Because we don't just want to recommend great gear. We want to solve your everyday problems. And trust me, we have the expertise to do just that.
Listen to The Wirecutter Show, hosted by me, Kyra Blackwell.
And me, Christine Cyr-Clisette. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Before we crack on with the next part of the podcast, I wanted to give a shout out to the sponsor of this episode, the Formula One Heineken Dutch Grand Prix. Although, given what's happened today, perhaps it should be the Formula One Heineken Verstappen Grand Prix. It's going to be a great celebration. Scott, we've both been to Zandvoort for this race. The Dutch Grand Prix is fantastic, wonderful event. There's nowhere quite like it, is there?
It is unique, and I believe that there is a reasonable amount of kind of frustration at the emergence of kind of identikit circuits, that kind of thing, the sort of new world order of where Formula One's gone schedule-wise. There's still so much to be said for kind of classic races, and Zandvoort, I think, is a really good example of something that has tapped into something historic and with actual meaning, and then throwing, the modern appeal and entertainment aspects of Formula One into the mix. When you've got that combination of a raucous fan base, the sea of orange in the crowd, and all of the off-track entertainment that they do put on, and you combine that with such a unique location by the actual sea, but also when you walk in through the main entrance and you just suddenly realise you're really in the middle of the sand dunes, and you can see parts of the track kind of undulating on your right as you walk in. I think you get a sense of something at Zandvoort that a lot of races don't actually offer.
Yeah, it's astounding that there's a Grand Prix there in the 21st century. I'd covered events at Zandvoort before, and obviously the previous Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, the last one was in 1985 when Niki Lauda got his last victory in F1, and I thought there was no chance. It was like, it's a shame I couldn't have seen Formula One when it was here. And so it's astounding to have a modern Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. It's amazing what they've pulled off. Really easy to get to, great transport links. So it's a really good one to go to, and it's easy for us to get to cover. So the same for all the fans there. Trains, buses to the circuit, bicycles, loads of people cycle as well. 30 minutes from Schiphol Airport. So all ways of getting there are absolutely available, and there's such a great energy with people coming in from everywhere in the area every morning.
I think it's one where once you've actually been and you get to experience of it, that kind of, I think it was Christian Horner who said it at the first edition of this race, wasn't it? Described it as like a 4-day rave. Unfortunately, that takes place at a time where we can never really partake.
Absolutely, but everyone seems to have an absolutely fantastic time there, and it's also just a fantastic place to watch Formula One cars with this fantastic environment. So register your interest in attending the 2025 Dutch Grand Prix today by clicking the link in the episode description. Let's get back to today now, Mark. Max Verstappen's fifth place was a good one, all things considered. The Red Bull was all over the place at the start of the weekend. You've talked a little bit about the downforce levels. The fact they don't have a bespoke ultra-low downforce rear wing, it's a bit of a surprise, isn't it? Because we were used to, at the start of these regulations, teams cutting and shutting to do it. But as Max Verstappen said on Saturday, I asked him about this, and he said it just feels like it's 2 race weekends we give up on by not having done this.
Yeah, and I mean, when you make these choices before the season's even started, you look globally at what your spread of downforce levels is going to be through the season, and you're offsetting that against a cost. And I guess in the previous 2 seasons, Red Bull have felt that they were being dominant enough that they could probably scratch by without the ultimate wing efficiency at 2 outlier circuits. Whereas they're not far enough clear to have that luxury now, as it turns out. So, we know how close all these teams are up at the edge, pushing against the cost cap limit, and that is an expense. It's a considerable expense developing an entirely new wing. It's a hugely complex thing, and it doesn't just involve designing that wing. It involves also working out what ultimate downforce levels all your other wings should be, your 4 or 5 other wings. So it's where you pitch everything. And so if you just take that one out, you've took a significant cost driver out of your budget. which you might feel you could better spend elsewhere, and it might give you greater advantage globally over the season. And that's clearly what they've felt. It's a more performance-efficient way of spending that money. But that was when they had a significant advantage. And it's, as Max says, well, it's maybe something we need to look at in future. But there's only one season left of these regulations, so maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just do the same again next year.
There's also maybe that extra dimension of the fact that throughout these regulations, pretty much because of how successful they've been, they don't have as much capacity to play with in terms of the aerodynamic testing restrictions. So if you want to develop new wings, that's as Mark outlined, a big resource drain, but it's also true of time and allowance. So if you think you can get more out of doing things on the floor, and it's a choice between doing floors or wings, in Red Bull's case, you've got to make a tougher choice than maybe teams who've got a bit more wriggle room and can do dual programs because they've got more allowance.
53 points behind McLaren. Red Bull are now down in third in the Constructors' Championship, mathematically still in it, but they were a long shot before it, and now they're a vanishingly long shot for that, even if Sergio Perez, who had another tough weekend and finished 10th, was to suddenly catapult back to form for Qatar and Abu Dhabi. I don't think Red Bull would be able to get it over the line anyway, but yeah, the Drivers' Championship was a big enough celebration for them. Scott, let's talk about McLaren now, because this was always likely to be the weakest race of this triple header that ends the season for McLaren. But how surprised were you to see Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri 6th and 7th?
Yeah, I think that was the main surprise. Not that they didn't win, because I think we all thought that Ferrari had the edge for this track, and versus McLaren, it certainly did. No one expected, obviously, Mercedes to come in and be the interloper for everybody. So the extent of the trouble and the fact that Verstappen managed to beat both of them as well will be the big disappointment for McLaren. This is a car that we've seen a few times this year. They've addressed the issue they had last season where they didn't have a good enough family of rear wings at low downforce. So when they go low drag, the car can actually be quite good, but it doesn't work at low drag in cold conditions like this one. And Norris said actually post-race that this has been a weakness that he's been banging on about basically for 6 years at McLaren and still hasn't been addressed. So it just wasn't one that brought the best out of the car. They struggled like everybody with the warm up of the tyres in qualifying. But then the problem in the race was that they just, again, like pretty much everybody that wasn't driving a Mercedes, just couldn't stop the graining. And then Andrea Stella said that it was only in the final stint when they seemed to make quite a few changes, extreme changes, I think he described them as, to the tools that are available to the driver within the car, and then also some driving style stuff, that Norris suddenly didn't have any graining anymore and was at the pace of the leaders. The only caveat to that you obviously have to add is by the end of the race is when the track's usually grippiest and warmest and graining should be less of an issue. The cars are also the lightest that they are the whole race, so there's just sort of less sliding about all over the place in general. So it's hard to judge how much McLaren actually got on top of that, because Stella said that there'll be useful learnings for the team, how much better it was in that final stint. The upshot was just a big disappointment. I mean, they're really lucky that Mercedes got in the way of Ferrari. Otherwise, this could have been a massive loss. If Ferrari had posted a 1-2 here and the McLarens had been not even on the podium, that'd have been an even bigger loss in the Constructors' Championship. So they've kind of got away lightly here. And now, obviously, they go to 2 circuits at the end of the season, Qatar in particular, where they should be a lot stronger.
There was definitely a sense that McLaren thought they might be a bit weak here because of those conditions and that particular long-term weakness in the car that Norris identified. And Stella was quite punchy in terms of it being a clear message to the men and women of McLaren, as he put it, to really utilise the learning to improve the car in the future. But he was also quite specific about Norris having a weakness with the front limitation, and when graining is the problem, being a bit too aggressive with the car. And I think it was Monza we saw that evident actually in the battle with Ferrari, and it was clearly going to be a problem here. And he talked on Saturday after qualifying about it being a struggle for Lando. So if he's made a driving style breakthrough in combination with some of those other learnings they did with the tools in that final stint, then that's going to be quite a big deal for Norris, I think, and it's sort of indicative of something we were talking about on another episode of the podcast about how quickly he learns. And Stella was pointing that out post-race as well in terms of referencing him against Max Verstappen as the benchmark. Lando's learned very quickly this season, and that's maybe another area that he's tidied up in what was otherwise quite a difficult weekend for McLaren.
We should note as well that Oscar Piastri did a little bit of bad parking at the start. Wasn't quite in his grid slot. I did ask him about that after the race. He didn't have any particular reason why it happened, just a slight misjudgment. It's hard to line these cars up. It wasn't quite as extreme as the Perez one a few races ago, but I don't think that made much difference to his race. It's just a 5-second penalty, but I think McLaren will be glad to be leaving Vegas and heading to Qatar, where the car should be good, and Abu Dhabi as well. You have to say McLaren still in a decent position to get that Constructors' Championship. Ben, let's get into the midfield now. Nico Hulkenberg won the midfield battle ahead of Yuki Tsunoda and Sergio Perez. Although he scored points in 4 of the last 5 events, his form did have a little bit of a wobble. So how good was this weekend from Nico Hulkenberg? Yeah,
it was a strong weekend. It has to be pleased to kind of bounce back after a pretty horrible Brazil where they were quick, but everything kind of went wrong in those awful conditions in the race. And Hulkenberg wasn't at it, I didn't feel, at a track where normally he excels. Here, obviously, as we've discussed at length, the fronts were very much the limitation, and that seems to suit Hulkenberg a bit better than, when you have that more prevailing rear or thermal degradation limitation. So he was comfortable. He was a little bit underwhelming qualifying. He felt that he should have been probably in the top 6. I think Komatsu felt similar, but the race was well executed, and it's maybe a disappointment they didn't get both cars in the points. But yeah, certainly they went well in this kind of low downforce, low drag configuration, and it's game on really in that tight battle, isn't it? Because Alpine had a tough race, RB were there or thereabouts, but not a huge swing. So yeah, one of the more exciting battles going into the final couple of races.
Yeah, Tsunoda's weekend was good on his way to 9th. It looked very promising for Alpine, didn't it, with Pierre Gasly up 3rd on the grid. Slipped back a little bit in the first stint inevitably, but he was still on for a decent number of points, and then had the PU failure. So yeah,
Theory pushed the big red button.
Exactly. So a tough day for Alpine after the glories of Brazil. In time-honoured tradition, the final part of this episode is devoted to questions from the Race Members Club. If you're interested in joining the Race Members Club, now is a great time to do it, as we have 2 Black Friday offers running on Patreon. You can get a 30% discount for your first month if you join either of our Racers tiers, one of which is focused solely on F1 content, or you can get 50% off our Top Champions tier by entering the code CHAMP, that's CHAMP in capitals, when prompted while signing up. You can find out more by clicking the link in the episode description for this podcast, or by heading to Patreon and searching for the race. And for those of you who aren't utterly fed up of hearing my voice, I've also now started a special bonus feature for the Race Members Club, where I record a short bonus podcast of just me on my own, answering questions about my ever controversial driver rankings that members can post on Patreon. So if you've ever thought I want more of Edd talking to himself, then that's the bonus content.
Who wouldn't want that, Edd? Eh?
Well, yeah, exactly.
When you said it was you answering questions, on your own, I genuinely immediately got the image of you posing questions to yourself. Like basically like creating sort of fictional arguments about your driver rankings that you then have to try and justify. If that is the premise of it, I will start listening to it.
Perhaps it might go that way. We're getting near the end of the season, so it might become more delirious. But yes, I did the first one after Brazil, and people seem to quite like it. So we're going to crack on with it. But yes, the Race Members Club questions now. Mark, the first question for you from Chris Parrott. Does this count as an opportunity missed by Ferrari in their fight versus McLaren in the Constructors' Championship?
Depends how you look at it. In terms of if they'd been able to, deliver a 1-2, it would have been a pretty resounding, difficult thing for McLaren, and they didn't. But when you look at the reasons why they weren't able to do that, I don't think they were ever in a position to, in hindsight. They just didn't have the pace with the car that they brought. It wasn't capable of delivering a Mercedes level of performance. So no, really, they got the maximum result they could have this weekend, I think.
The only slight caveat, according to Fred Vasseur, is he feels that if Leclerc had somehow managed to pull that move off on Russell, which he didn't quite do, wasn't really on, was it, at the outside of turn 1, he feels the race would have been a different story because Leclerc would have had the clean air to try and manage the tyres. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily square with the lack of downforce compared to Mercedes, but certainly would have changed the complexion of the race. But of course, it was mission critical because he didn't do it, and in trying to do it and failing, he screwed the tyres. So we'll never know.
Scott, next we'll come to you. This is a topic we'll probably talk about in more depth in a future episode, but we can do the quick potted version here and address the question. Hugo Pring says, do you expect the story regarding GM becoming an 11th F1 team after the departure of Michael Andretti will gradually fade away in the days following the Las Vegas Grand Prix? I'm old and cynical, but I doubt the teams and Stefano Domenicali have any real desire to have an 11th team, but just want to pay lip service to the concept when in the US and when Donald Trump has just won the election and is talking about introducing tariffs.
Well, Hugo, I'm sort of youngish and cynical, so I understand where you're coming from. So this isn't just kind of speculation about whether or not General Motors could get in now that Michael Andretti's gone. If it was that kind of discussion around it, I think that would be a very valid concern, because it would be a talking point, wouldn't it? It would be a topic that's arisen because F1's back in the US and all of the reasons that he's mentioned in the question. But that isn't what's happening here. The understanding is that proper progress has been made, with it being a General Motors fronted entry rather than an Andretti one. It will still be Andretti Global running it, but it won't be Michael Andretti that's actually behind it. That's in the hands of Dan Tauris now. Mark Walters, the money man is the best way to describe him there. He's the Guggenheim CEO. And obviously there's been this investigation in the US with the Department of Justice. You're right, Ed, we can get into the specifics more often, but there have been some significant developments over the last few months with this. It's been an impasse for a while, but I would suspect a desire to resolve it. The fact that Michael Andretti isn't there day-to-day, blah, blah, blah. GM being committed to being there much more involved from the very start, I think, in an ownership capacity rather than just blessing the project with the Cadillac name, just means that it's now moved forward enough for what we've heard, what we've been told to have come out. And it's not a coincidence, I suspect, that it's come out around the Vegas weekend, because it was I'm pretty sure it was Vegas last year where the GM 2028 engine project stuff emerged, or in the build-up to that race. So it's a handy one timing wise for a bit of attention in the US, but it's a real story rather than just people talking about it.
Yeah, as I say, we'll probably return to that in the not too distant future. Ben, a question from David Hiss. For those of you in Las Vegas, watching on TV, the feeling I got of the crowd in the stands and around the podium was rather dispassionate. Was it the same on the ground?
Well, David, difficult for me to give you a sense of what it was like in the grandstands, because we're not really in that zone. We're kind of paddock to media centre, yomping from quite a distance actually from the Tuscany Hotel and Casino over to the circuit. Certainly the race still had the party atmosphere. There were lots of people there. There was lots going on, and the sense around the circuit in Las Vegas itself, there was a lot of buzz and excitement for F1 throughout the week, actually, and loads of fan zones, lots of people here, locals, tourists, people from abroad, people from elsewhere in the States. I think it's always difficult to kind of match the massive hype of the first race, but still there's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement. And F1 in Las Vegas is here to stay. So I think you get a disconnect as well between sometimes the TV pictures and what it's like on the ground, because they're doing different things, and there's a lot in the kind of nighttime big light spectacle. From afar, they're trying to give you the kind of almost bird's eye view of the circuit and the atmosphere, but on the ground it was definitely hustle and bustle.
Question now I'll take from Bert Bertson. Why were so few hard compound tyres allocated this weekend? It's a good simple answer to that one. The tyre allocation for a normal race weekend, i.e. a non-sprint weekend, is standardised. So you get 2 hards, 3 mediums and 8 softs for your 13 sets. That's just what happens. Ever since the COVID season in 2020, you used to be able to choose how many sets of each tyre you had, but for pragmatic reasons, getting the show back on the road with the restrictions in COVID, they standardised it and they've stuck with standardising it. Mark, a question now from David Baker. Does the Las Vegas combination of night race, street circuit and cold temperatures make it the perfect Joker race, or is it just too much?
Oh, I'm all for a Joker race because, you know, it's not without merit. It's still, you've still got to solve a set of equations, and it's just a different set of equations to those that you normally have to solve. So, you know, it's the same for everyone. And yeah, it's given us a bit of a different result this weekend, and yeah, I'm all for that. But yes, that is a very unusual combination. It's not just the nighttime low temperatures, but and the circuit layout, but it's also the surface itself, which is just super smooth, very very low grip. And yeah, that's certainly contributed towards the competitive order this weekend.
Scott, a question from Mark, who describes this as a serious but also not serious question. So I think you're the perfect person for a serious but not serious question. What is more useful, Checo Perez or a chocolate teapot? A harsh question as well.
That is harsh. Is the chocolate teapot made out of Kit Kats? Checo has a Kit Kat deal, doesn't he? And the social media conspiracy theory of, not the moment, but certainly 2 weeks ago, I think, when it was announced, was, I don't know if either of you are aware of this, but F1 will have an official chocolate bar next year, and it will be Kit Kat. So the conspiracy theory goes that that's the reason Perez has kept his seat, because he's a Kit Kat ambassador, and therefore this deal wouldn't have been possible for Formula One if they axed him.
What an excellent response to that question. You've done very well. Yeah,
I'm not answering the actual question, other than the fact that of course he's more useful than a chocolate teapot when it comes to driving a Formula One car. When it comes to being a chocolate teapot, Checo's not as useful as a chocolate teapot.
Talking of Kit Kat, I think it's time Checo had a break.
Yes, it's not getting any better for him, sadly, having a tough time. Ben, a question from Stranded Colourwork. With Franco Colapinto's moment in quali, despite being the lead qualifying Williams this weekend, pre-pit lane start decision, there are some comparisons being made on social media comparing his and Logan Sargent's crash bills. At this point, how fair or appropriate is a direct comparison between the two?
Well, I mean, crash bills are the story of Williams' season, aren't they? And actually, you can throw Alex Albon into that mix too. He's probably ahead slightly, although some of them, not his fault. He's been wiped out a couple of times. I think it's probably fair to compare. I mean, the Colapinto crash in qualifying here was a bit needless and silly when you know how short Williams are on spare parts, how much work they've had to put in to get the cars ready even for Vegas. It felt like Franco was laying it all out on the line a bit too much in that final sector, having maybe started his lap a little bit undercooked, and he just didn't need to do that in Williams' situation. Obviously, he's operating at a much higher level than Sargent as a base. There's maybe a small risk that as he's trying to push more and find more, that he's venturing into similar Sargent, I just crash and make mistakes when I try and do that territory, but it's probably a bit too early to say, and they probably will forgive a bit more just because that baseline level is so much higher than what they had before.
Next question I'll take. It's a combination question from Andy Sally, Stuart Coulter and Andreas Halmerson. How did Carlos Sainz get away with cutting the pit lane entrance line after diving back out of the pit entry at the last second? Why was there no penalty? Well, the stewards did have a look at it and they decided it wasn't worth any further investigation, so they didn't think it was worth a penalty. There were a few teams that were slightly surprised by that, but yeah, ultimately it's the stewards that do that, and they were aware of it and were happy. So yeah, perhaps the fact that he was told to come in and then told to stay out at the last minute was taken into account as mitigation. But yeah, maybe dodged a bullet on that one, but perhaps not completely clear cut. Mark, a question from Chris Casabianca. Based on the McLaren pace in Baku compared with today, has the directive to change the rear wing impacted them more than originally thought?
No, I don't think it's to do with that. Obviously, that rear wing was helping them, but not to the extent of losing them, half a second or more of performance, which is what you're looking at when you're comparing to the cars around them. I think is much more to do with, as we talked about before, generating tyre temperatures. That's Vegas this weekend. Tyre temperatures was far more dominant than aerodynamics, which is, you hear about how downforce is everything, but given that everybody's at a similar level of downforce, when you introduce a huge variation in how much tyre grip each car has got, according to whether it can get the temperatures or not, then that becomes the dominant factor. And that. So it's a much, much bigger factor than any difference between two specs of a similar wing would possibly get you.
Scott, a question from Ethan Fish. They decided to switch races around before due to temperature. Why have they not made a point in saying that Vegas should be moved closer to the US Grand Prix so that the evening temperatures are nicer?
Because they want this race to occupy this slot. Very simple. It's I think the lowest foot traffic weekend of the year for Las Vegas. Other than that, it's Thanksgiving weekend, isn't it? In the States. So it's directly related to trying to have the biggest possible economic interest and benefit for the city of Las Vegas. Don't forget that the promoter here is the authority that includes all of the hotels and casinos, basically, all the big players anyway. So it's all about putting as much money in everybody's pocket as possible and then having tax benefits for the people that live there, because there's obviously loads of money going into various places, and theoretically anyway, everybody should benefit from the place getting a little bit richer. Not sure if that actually works out in reality, but that is certainly the justification for it. So yeah, there's no you can't achieve that if you change the date, because then you're defeating the purpose of having this Grand Prix on the quietest weekend of the year.
Ben, James Godfrey Moon asks, anyone else getting early 2000s Sauber vibes from VCARB this weekend? Definitely an improvement.
Well, James, I wasn't actually until you mentioned it, but now you do mention it. Yeah, it did have a hint of Petronas green on the side pods, didn't it? I didn't spot Kimi Räikkönen or Nick Heidfeld hanging around the RB hospitality unit. But yeah, it looked decent. There were a few efforts at special liveries. That was probably the most striking one. I think it worked a bit better than the Sauber one, that's for sure. And it was a decent weekend for the team as well. They threw a lot at this race, not only paint at the car. They had a massive upgrade, some Red Bull 2024 spec suspension on the car, plus some other upgrades aerodynamically. It was reckoned to be worth, a tenth and a half, I think, Ed. And yeah, decent performance as well. Certainly from Tsunoda, he was on it. He looks like he's really trying to force the issue with Red Bull to get himself in that Perez seat, even if it's on like a race-by-race trial basis next year. Liam Lawson, a bit more difficult for him, obviously his first time at Vegas. He was struggling to get the brakes working well, struggling with the tyres, as everyone was, but maybe it was a bit more pronounced for him. Doesn't reward anyone with a particularly attacking style, I don't think. When you've got that limitation at the front, you need to be a bit more contained. But yeah, a decent weekend for them. And obviously they're throwing everything at trying to win this battle for 6. So we'll see if it pays off over the final 2. But I don't think that livery will stay for the final 2 races.
And the final question I'll take from Chris and Gandu. Why does Alpine seem unable to run a 2-car operation? Today they called Esteban Ocon in and nobody was there to pit him. Always one driver getting nonsense calls. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to criticise Alpine, and we've been very critical of Alpine at times. I think they do run a 2-car team pretty well. But this particular scenario, yes, Ocon was given a box opposite Hulkenberg call, which means if Hulkenberg doesn't pit, you do pit, and if he comes in, you stay out. And Ocon followed that instruction because Hulkenberg stayed out. So Ocon came in, drove down the pit lane, and then he did his rather forlorn message. I didn't see the pit board. And he didn't see the pit board because the crew weren't out in the pit lane. And the team said, yes, definitely something went wrong. Ollie Oakes, the team principal, said we need to investigate it. He was sort of quite reticent to commit a full explanation before they've really looked into it. From what I can make out, what I think happened, because normally, particularly if you've got a box opposite or a potential pit stop, normally the pit crew will get a warning, a certain margin out, certain number of seconds, and then there'll be a confirmation one, like maybe 20 seconds later. And I presume they were on standby because they were sort of starting to mill around, but I don't think they got the final go. So something went wrong. Either somebody didn't issue the instruction, or there was some technical problem with because obviously they've all got their own little communications circuit. So the pit crew just didn't get the call for whatever reason. And yeah, poor old Esteban Ocon had to just roll through the pit lane, gave himself a drive-through, and pitted again. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty bad error from Alpine. They'll be annoyed about that because Ocon would have been able to pick up a few points had he had a normal race. So it's not great, but I've not seen anything quite like that from Alpine before, and it's just one of those things where stuff just goes spectacularly wrong.
It's just unfortunately part of the wider narrative of the team that when it can have such fantastic highs, it can also have such crushing lows. And I'm amused that this happened, not because of Alpine, but because obviously Pierre Gasly had the failure in the race, having qualified third, and I think I said to you, Ed, like, it just feels so Alpine that they get a double podium in Brazil where that result is nowhere near on the cards. And then they actually qualify in the top three and they don't score any points because one car breaks and then the other one has some kind of baffling setback. And if I can very briefly put it into football terms, because I actually said this to our boss, Glenn Freeman, Bring Back V10's host that everybody who listens to that podcast will be familiar with. I actually described his football team, Tottenham Hotspur, as the Alpine of football yesterday, because I had seen Spurs get described as having the biggest gap between their performance ceiling and their performance basement, and that's Alpine, isn't it, in Formula One? There's not a team on the grid that has a bigger gap between their best and their worst.
Yeah, very, 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 very true. From one extreme to the other. Ollie Oakes, when he spoke to us after the race, he sort of came and said, "Well, this just shows the highs and lows of motorsport, isn't it? In two races, you go from things going great to drawing a blank." Well, thanks very much, Scott, Ben, and Mark, for your excellent analysis of the Las Vegas Grand Prix. It's on to part 2 of the season-ending triple header next, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.